Okay, we're rolling.
All right, this is an interview at the New York State Military Museum, Saratoga Springs, New York. It is the 17th of November, 2006, approximately 1 p.m. Interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Stephen Caine, 1942, May 2nd, 1942, New York, New York.
Okay. What was your educational background prior to entering service?
I had a BS from Cortland. I had a MS from Cornell and Elmira College in Elmira, New York.
Okay. Did you enlist or were you drafted?
I enlisted.
You enlisted. Okay. Were you in an officer candidate program?
Correct.
No? Okay. Where was that?
That was at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas.
Okay. Why did you decide to enlist, and why did you pick the Air Force?
That's an interesting question. I didn't have to, and I was a school teacher, so I was exempt from the draft. I got interested in aviation and earned all my pilot ratings and went into aviation and decided that I wanted to fly with the airlines, and actually worked at a place called Minor Aeronautical. I was kind of like an instructor for them there. And I realized that I didn't want to continue to do that, and it looked like at the time the airlines had stopped hiring and that I needed to build more time. So I wanted to go in the Air Force and fly big airplanes and then get out and be an airline pilot. Mm-hmm. And I went in, and I actually, having had a great advantage of having all my ratings already, did well in pilot training, where I had a choice of airplanes that I could take. I was even offered the first C-5 that was available to a young fellow out of pilot training. But by the time I went through pilot training, I realized that if I could be, I wanted to be a fighter pilot. And it so happened that I was able, I ended up, I say this humbly because I had a lot of experience. I was #1 in my class, so I was able to pick my airplane, and I picked the F-4. And found my niche in life. So I never even decided to go with the airlines.
Okay. Could you tell us about your training experiences and somewhat the things that stand out?
Well, sure. First of all, I have to say something about my wife. She married a school teacher and paid for my ratings in civil aviation, and then I decided I wanted to go in the Air Force. And you know, I used to get home from work at a reasonable hour of the day, and it was not dangerous. And then I told her one day I wanted to go in the Air Force, and we had a child, and our second child was on the way, and she supported me through that. And 3 days after my second child was born, we moved out to Enid, Oklahoma, and that's where pilot training was. But she was an amazing woman, and it still is, and supported me throughout. But pilot training was at Enid, Oklahoma Advanced Air Force Base. You had a small reciprocating engine. It was like a Cessna 172 for basic. Very basic training, just to kind of call and find those that may not be adaptable to flying. And then it was followed by a T-37, which was a small jet, probably was about as fast as a Mustang in World War II. And then the T-38, which was a supersonic jet, in which you had training and formation and night flying and many of the things you do in fighters. And then once I got the fighter, after that, the training, you had another 6 to 8 months in further training in the F-4, where you learned formation, instrument flying, how to drop bombs, how to strafe, how to fight air combat, how to plan missions with large numbers of airplanes, and analyze the threat and use the right tactics and so forth.
Now, what year was this?
1970, I was commissioned in May of 1970, and that June is when I went to after going to survival school, you have a sea survival, and eventually I had jungle survival, and POW survival type schools. But June '70 is when I went into pilot training. I graduated from that in '71, and then actually left. The F4 training was January or February '72, and then I went to my first operational unit in February of '72, and then in May I went to Thailand and Vietnam.
So you were about 30 years old at that time.
I was 27.
Oh, 27.
I just made it in by my the age limit for getting into the service.
Mhm.
Yes, yeah, you're exactly right. And so I was long in the tooth and older than my.
Yeah, I was
We
gonna say
had
you
two
were-
children. We had two children, and most of the folks were just married and getting out of college.
Mhm.
So it was a little different.
So you were kind of the old man of the...
I was not the highest ranking man. We had captain in the class, but I was the old man. There's no doubt about that.
Now, why did you like the F4? What did you like about it?
The mission. Well, first of all, the F4 is very versatile. It could fly, and it was used to fly air combat. It was used to support the ground troops, and it was used to carry nuclear weapons too. I mean, everything that you could do in a fighter, you did in it. It was, at the time, it was the most high-tech, powerful, maneuverable, versatile airplane, and that was there, and it was the most challenging. Being in the fighter business in the Air Force at the time was the top of the line. I mean, it was the greatest contribution you could make. If you were lucky enough to be given the God-given talents to do it and having the right combination of things, it was that was the fullest use of your talents. And it was a mission that it was. You were great teamwork. You were on a team, in a squadron, or in a flight with people that you admired, and you all pulled together. And you had belly laughs when you weren't flying. It was just it was like being on a ball team for serious business, but very gratifying in my view. And I believe in military service, as you all do. I mean, I felt like I was contributing to my country, and so it all fit for me, and I liked it.
Now, was your wife able to travel around with you from base to base?
Well,
Probably until you left for Thailand.
yeah, we all went together to Enid, Oklahoma, and then to Phoenix, and then we moved to Alamogordo, New Mexico, which was the home of the 49th TAC Fighter Wing, and we got a place on base there where she lived. And then when I went over to Thailand, it was a unit move over to Thailand, where it was on a temporary duty type of thing, although it ended up being 6 months. And she stayed right there. But then when I got back, I stayed there another 6 months and then went to Korea for a year. And then she moved to Connecticut near her mother. And then we've moved every place ever since together, for 20 plus moves. We spent a lot of time in Europe, and in the Southwest, 3 times in Washington.
Could you talk to us about your time in Thailand, Vietnam,
Sure.
what that was like?
Sure. I went there, as I said, I left F4 basic F4 training in February, and I got to Holland. And at the time, when you left your initial F4 training, you were what they called Phase 2. You weren't combat ready yet. You had the basic skills, but you had to be adapted. You had to be trained in the unit mission. You had to do a bit more refinement. And I was Phase 2 when I got there, and when the unit deployed to South Vietnam, or to Thailand, I was still Phase 2. And I still count my lucky stars, and I have to give the name of a guy named Don Hobart, who was a squadron commander. I was in the 8th TAC Fighter Squadron, 49th TAC Fighter Wing. He took the Phase 2 guys with the unit when it deployed. Other squadrons didn't do that. So when I got to combat, the first 10 rides I had to have an instructor with me because I wasn't mission ready yet. And after that, the F-4 is a two-place airplane, so after that I had what they call a weapon system operator flying in the back seat, and that's a navigator who'd been trained in the operation of systems in the F-4. In Vietnam, the reason we went in the first place, that was during the Nixon period of Vietnamization, and they had pulled out a lot of United States ground troops. And in the spring of 1972, the North invaded with regular forces into South Vietnam, and the United States sent 5 fighter wings over there. My wing was dedicated, what was called a dual base wing, was dedicated to NATO and Europe. And I had just finished writing a letter to my parents saying, they were describing about all these units that were going over to war in Vietnam, and I was just saying to my mom and dad in a letter, this will never happen to us, because we're dedicated to Europe, and we actually had a nuclear mission in Europe, which I could talk about a little bit later. And a week later, there wasn't an airplane on the ramp left. There were 94 F-4s at Holloman, and they had all deployed to South Vietnam. The first missions that I really went on were close air support missions, where we had Mark 82s and napalm, and we were supporting ground forces that, and most importantly, were close in contact, where they would have Viet Cong or North Vietnamese regulars, pushing them and putting pressure on them where they couldn't handle it by themselves. And we would meet with a FAC, a forward air controller. He would mark the targets for us, and we would go in and strike them. I first ought to kind of tell you the profile that we would use in flying. We basically had 2 ways of approaching missions in Vietnam. Actually more than that, but we were in Thailand, so we had to be refueled, mid-air refueled, en route to get to the target area in South Vietnam or North Vietnam. So we would take off out of Tak Ly, which was rather in central Thailand, and then just on the border of Vietnam we'd hook up with a tanker. We would refuel there, and then we would go into South Vietnam. We would be told where a FAC would be, a forward air controller, and then we would meet up with that FAC. He would describe where the troops were, what the best approach to the target would be, north, south, east, or west, what a safe bailout area was, and we would go in and strike the target, and then we would normally recover in Vietnam. We'd come off the target, do a battle damage check, and then go either to a base called Da Nang in northern South Vietnam, or Ben Hoa, which is near Saigon, down in the south. We'd reload there, and then go up and either hit another target and come back to one of those bases, or hit a target and come back out, hit a tanker and come home. So there were times when we would fly out of Thailand, hit a tanker, hit a target, land, take off, hit a target, land in South Vietnam, take off, hit a target, then go to a tanker and come home. We would use that profile too for hitting targets in southern North Vietnam. And if we went into North Vietnam, we would generally be hitting bridges, trying to hit supplies before they got into South Vietnam. The other kind of mission was only out and back, and that was when we went into deep North Vietnam, into the route packs 5 and 6, which are up around Hanoi and in that area. And traditionally on that, we would get up at 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and then brief, and then take off right at dawn or a little bit before that. And we'd go up into the Gulf of Tonkin and refuel, and come in over Haiphong Harbor, which was just south of China, or we'd come up over Laos and refuel, and come in from Laos into North Vietnam. And the targets we would hit there were airfields, railroad yards, and barracks. Probably my most exciting mission was going after a MiG base. We used to go after MiG bases. For earlier in the war, and I was on the thing we were fighting was called Linebacker 2. In Linebacker 1 you couldn't hit MiG bases, and Linebacker 2 you could hit MiG bases. And when you did that, the defenses were the greatest. It was especially, and I was a lieutenant, so I was generally the last guy in line, or one of the last guys in line. So you would have 24 airplanes. This wasn't like World War II, I mean, where you had thousands, but you'd have airplanes that would go in and would throw some chaff around, muck up their radars. You'd have some wild weasels that would try to strike some of the SAM sites, and then you'd have us come in. And by the time you got the 24th, I mean, this thing would be 20 miles long. And by the time the last few guys were in there, I mean, the sky would be, you know, a dome of flak right over the airfield, and of course you'd have SAMs coming up through this thing. But we had what they call electronic pods, which were countermeasures to the SAM, and nobody in our unit ever got hit by a SAM. We were very lucky. The unit, and I flew 110 missions there. There was one other lieutenant. Now we had backseaters and front seaters. The front seaters were pilots, and so you were really a junior guy if you were a front seat pilot. We had lieutenant weapon system operators who were in the back. Most of the guys in the outfit had been there twice before. In the earlier days, I was one of the first classes where they took guys from pilot training and put them in the front seat of the F-4. In the earlier days, when you came out of pilot training, they put a pilot in the back seat where the weapon system operator. You get a tour in the back seat, and then they put you in the front seat. So a lot of the guys that I had flown with in Vietnam had been there twice before. Once as backseaters, and then once as front seaters. So they were very experienced in the area. So we were there for 6 months and flew very intensely. Our unit flew over 8,000 missions. And we flew an awful lot at night, too. I'd say a little more than half our missions were at night. And that was pretty thrilling.
In what way?
Well, just the environment with thunderstorms, and you could see the enemy fire a lot better at night, but they couldn't see you, so that was nice. I mean, unless they had a radar gun. And you could see SAMs better. But just to get out and back through the weather and stuff was, you know, pretty trying.
Any encounters with MiGs at all?
No, I never did. And there were units that were over there that their job was to fly against MiGs, and you know, the MiGs were very selective. I don't know if you've been watching that thing Dogfight on Friday nights, 10 o'clock. It's very good. On the History Channel.
Yeah.
They had them on the other night. They said they had 12 MiGs. I think they had more than that, MiG-21s. I have flown against MiGs, and I can talk to you about that later. But I didn't ever tangle with MiG, which I'm very glad about. They didn't have that many of them.
Now the close air missions where you started from Thailand, refueled, and then delivered your ordnance, and then landed again. So how long would that be approximately in time?
Well, you could. This is the thing. Normally, you have an 8-hour day, a crew day of 8 hours, and we had exemptions often where we would be 12 hours, and that's. And I've had missions there where I've been airborne 8 hours with constant refuelings, where you know the target was, the weather was bad and stuff like that, and you've refueled several times. But I've had that long mission.
Did you ever have to stay over in Vietnam at all?
Oh yeah. Your airplanes, one of the most interesting times I had was my airplane broke at Da Nang. And of course at night you'd have gunships around the base, you know, they used to be called spookies or something, I think it was. They were DC-3s.
Right.
But I had flown into around Way. We had done a lot of work around Way. It was south of the demilitarized zone. My airplane had a generator problem, and so I stayed on the ground. And I wanted to go with up for a FAC ride with, so I went to the squadron. I can't remember if they were Covey or Nail. I think it was Nail. They were OV-10s, and you know, we went in on passes. We were about 500 knots. 450, 500 knots, and I went in and I said, can I get a ride with you? And it was a crusty lieutenant colonel coming out. He says, come on with me, I'm the squadron commander, I'll gladly give you a ride. And I was up in the same area I was the day before, going around at 500 knots, 150 knots. And he took me to different areas. We went down along the beach, and here's guys walking around the beach with AK-47s. I mean, you know, we were 100 feet off the ground, and right they were. And then he took me around out over the water. He said, this is where one of my guys won a Congressional Medal of Honor. And I don't remember the gentleman's name, but he had a guy with him. OV-10 is a two-place airplane. They got hit by something, and the canopy got bent. And he knew, the front seater knew he could eject, but the back seater, the guy who he gave a ride to, couldn't eject. And so the guy stuck with it. The pilot stuck with it and went into the water. And the guy in the back seat was able to get out, but the pilot drowned in the front seat. So and it was quite moving. And I had been down and around Saigon, you know, broken airplanes basically. And it was always, they always treated us very hospitably.
Now, when you went on the close air support missions as opposed to the ones deep into Vietnam, North Vietnam, and so on, what were the differences in your ordnance that you carried?
The ones in the South Vietnam were more anti-personnel. So you had what you call Snake Eye, which was a Mark 82 500-pounder that had a fuse extender on it, which was you had a regular fuse. It's called a 904, kind of a spinning thing that was on the end. And we had most of our fuses were two fuses, 904 and 905, what they call it. And many of them were from World War II. But this thing had you had the front of the bomb. There's a casing. There's a hole in the front of the bomb where you screw in the fuse. And this was a fuse extender. It was a rod about that long that took it out about 3 feet, and then the regular fuse on the end of that. So as the bomb came down, it would go off about 3 feet above the surface of the ground. It didn't go into the ground and then penetrate and then blow up. So you had a chance of killing more people. The same with napalm. War is dirty stuff. And we also had what they call CBU, cluster munitions. And the missions north, you would put a delay. These are one of my jobs throughout my service. I was what they call a weapons and tactics officer when I was a young guy. You would figure out that you could actually delay when the bomb would blow up. It would penetrate and then blow up. And when you go after rail yards or airfields or things like that, you wanted the bomb to penetrate into the cement before it blew. So you didn't use fuse extenders, or you tried to get it into there. So that was it. And you'd have caps on some of the bombs if you're going after cement, so the bomb didn't break up before it blew up.
What was it like on your base when you were back at your base in Thailand?
It was, we had different we had tankers on the base, air refueling kind of guys. We had guys that were there we reopened the base. The base, let me back up a minute. The base had been closed in about 1968, and then when we had this, I'm trying to remember the Joint Chief of Staff expression for it, but there was an operation to bring all these 5 fighter wings over, so we reopened Tak Lee, and it was just us there. They had to clean the place out of cobras. I mean, it was a mess. A lot of the copper had been torn out. We cooked on the barbecue was a match springs, you know, the springs, you use that for bed match. The swimming pool by the officers club was used for fires, you know, fire extinguisher. It was green when we first got there. we had to bring in all the bedding, everything, hospitals, equipment, and things like that. And then after the base had been reestablished for a while, they brought in tankers, KC-135s, and then one of the fighter units that was over in Da Nang, over in Vietnam, came to our base. So there were squadrons over there that just stayed there for 10 years, you know, during the length of the war, and they rotated guys through for a year. You know, they'd be on a remote tour and they'd stay there a year. Our unit was there, the whole unit came over together and the whole unit was going to come back. We were replaced by the F-111s that came over and when we came home. And it was, the units, we were very congenial, but there was no really getting together except for mission planning, if you had mission planning. Life was 7 days a week. When we flew, as I say, we flew an awful lot at night, so we get home at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and we go to the bar. We had our own little bar, and we, you know, after you've lived through missions at night, there's nothing like talking about it and kind of letting yourself down. And you know, we'd have a few beers and then go to bed about 8 o'clock in the morning, and then get up about 7, 8 hours later, go out and, you know, just do whatever you're going to do, and then start about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, start getting ready with briefings and so forth, and then take off at sunset. And that would be the routine for 6 days a week for most people. And then on the 7th day, you generally, and it wouldn't be a Sunday, you generally have you'd be a duty officer or something like that. And if you had a mission north, you'd sleep at night as best you could, and then the next day you get up at, as I said, 3:30, 4 o'clock, and then do your mission. And be home about 2 o'clock in the afternoon from that. You know, and take off at dawn or a little bit before and home. And those are pretty complex missions, not like the World War II guys where you had all these rendezvous from different bases, but well, you did. You had different elements coming in from different bases, sequenced. But they weren't as big as World War II. But an F-4 carried the same as a B-17.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then once we got, later on in the war in Vietnam, they started getting laser bombs and laser-guided bombs, and then, you know, 4 airplanes could do what 100 could do. A lot of my experiences after that. I mean,
yes, right, okay.
You know,
so you left, when did you leave Southeast Asia?
well, I was there 6 months.
6 months. Okay.
And so I came home, and then 6 months, I got 243 hours of combat time, and I went there as a junior lieutenant, and I came back there having been shot at quite a bit, and an experienced guy. I was there another 6 months at Holloman, and then checked out as a flight leader, and you know, moved up. I was a wingman. You know, Vietnam, junior guy, and then went to Korea for a year, and my wife, as I said, moved to Connecticut. The mission in Korea, the atmosphere was almost like it was in Vietnam, in that it was always on the brink. There was always something going on there, and still is.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And there were times when we were almost scrambled, and the North Koreans were always coming south. There was always gun battles in the ocean. They were bringing spies in, and the mission there was air defense, and or close air support, or nuclear. And we sat air defense alert in our F-4s, and we also sat nuclear alert. And they used to put nukes on the bottom of an F-4. And that was 1973, and I'll always remember it because that was when the Yom Kippur War was in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And the Russians said that we better watch out, we better not help them. And Nixon put the whole United States military on what they call DEFCON 3. It's the step before absolute outbreak of war. And when you sat nuclear alert, you had these kind of codes in there, in your cockpit, and you had a nuclear. and you had practice codes, and you had real codes. And you would practice quite a bit. And this was, you would have a situation where Washington would, the Pentagon would flash an alert to a base, overseas, anywhere it could be, and you would scramble. And it could be in the middle of the night, and you would rush to your airplane and get into it. It was all cocked and ready to go, and you didn't know until they started giving you some letters whether you were going to go to the practice stuff or the real stuff. When we went DEFCON 3, you take all the practice stuff out of the airplane. There's no practice. I mean, if you're going to scramble, you know, in DEFCON 3 is the real thing. I happened to be out at the alert pad on alert. I was on air defense alert. No, I was on nuclear alert. And I was on nuclear alert. And they scrambled the air defense fighters, which were F-4s just like us. And we thought the war had begun because of all the stuff, and we didn't know what it was. And what it was SR-71 had an engine failure over North Korea, and they sent up the F-4s to escort it down. It wasn't, but I mean, that was one of my, I thought we were about ready to go to war with the North Koreans and Russians. But that was an interesting year, and again, it helped me in my career. I learned more, and then I went back to Holloman again, the same base I was before that. And I ended up, which is kind of interesting, being one of the initial pilots in the F-16 in the Air Force. They selected 10 pilots to be the first pilots in the F-16. And I had been to weapons school. Weapons school is like Top Gun, you know, like the Navy Top Gun. And they wanted an F-4 weapons school guy in the program. So I went to that. And that was interesting. And did I keep talking when you wanted to ask a question?
No, not yet. Well, I'll ask, how did the F-16 compare to the F-4?
F-4. Incomparable. It was a single seat, single engine airplane, which is in the fighter pilot parlance the Cadillac kind of stuff. It had better than 1-to-1 thrust rate ratio, so you accelerate going up. It could pull 9 Gs. It was totally computerized. It had this thing called fly-by-wire. You sat 30 degrees back in your seat. You had a radar, the F-4 radar. It was an older system, would break at a fairly decent rate. This one hardly ever broke. It was a quantum leap in capability, and you know, so it was really quite something. Now the mission it did, and I want to blend in a little bit of the Cold War here, because the Cold War, I kind of lived through. I came into the service in the Cold War, and then things changed, and then I was kind of in the post-Cold War. And each of them had a kind of different taste to them, a different flavor. And in the Cold War, you know, Vietnam was a subset of that. Korea was really a subset of that. But throughout it, I had mostly been dedicated. My outfits were all dedicated to going to Europe to fight the Russians. And in the F-4 and the F-16 was the same thing. The scenario that we always trained against and that we always thought would exist would be the following. The Russians always had the Soviet Union always had many more ground troops than NATO did on the western side of Germany. And they had many more airplanes too. So our job, a lot of times we practiced exercises where they would bring ground troops. They were called crested cap. They'd bring hundreds of thousands of ground troops in the fall over to Europe, and they'd bring fighter wings over to Europe. And this went on for years and years and years. And we were tied with bases. We knew places to go in case we punched out. You know, we had different, we learned the terrain, we learned secret areas and so forth. And we had targets we studied in the United States for when we were going to go overseas. And we also, when we were over there, I was based in Germany, we had specific targets too. But the scenario in the Cold War was that the Russians and the Soviet Union would come in with fighters and bombers and bomb and attack Western Europe. And our first job in the F-4 and the F-16 was to rise up and counter them and knock them down, and then start going into their airfields and reduce their air force so that they couldn't help their ground troops. Our next job in fighters, after we got the air situation kind of stabilized in the Cold War, was to help the ground troops like we did in Vietnam and do close air support. We were also supposed to do interdiction where we hit their supply areas and so forth. But there was the realization and the thought that they had such massive ground troops and such a massive ground capability that we would have to use tactical nukes. So the last thing we trained on were tactical nukes, where we would knock out bridges, knock out main things with nukes that were about the size of Hiroshima. I mean, they were that big. And so, you know, 2 guys in F-4 and 1 guy in an F-16 were supposed to do that. And we had all kinds of safety measures. You know, we were on what they call human reliability. They always monitored each of us to make sure we weren't under any undue tension, you know, and that we were reliable. And are we getting close to the end of that?
No.
And so the F-4, that's what I trained for in the F-4, and that's what I trained for in the F-16. And the F-16 was better, significantly better at air defense, air combat, support of ground troops, and the nuclear mission, because you use your radar to do it at night, than the F-4. So that.
Did you ever have many problems with the computers and so on? Since
No, they were very. Well, when we first got into them, the way we trained I went out to Edwards. They were still in the process of testing the airplane, and I got 10 missions in it, and I became an instructor pilot, and that's the way it worked. And we barely knew how to run the computers. I mean, we were just. We could take them off, land them. We knew more than the test pilots about how air to air and things like that, but. There were times we would mess up the computers. We get out to the end of the runway and call into the squadron and say, well, this is what the picture is. This is how I think I screwed up. Can you help me back out of this thing? And it was very good to have radio. So, yeah, there were a lot of times that...
I was wondering, because we've done interviews with some A6 pilots, and they were very computerized in Vietnam, and they had a lot of computer hit glitches, so I was just curious.
No, it was very much the same.
Mm-hmm. So, there was something about Migs in Europe or something versus Migs. You wanted to
part of our, I don't know if anybody talked to you about Red Flag. They realized that, and this is part of the training, that they realized that most losses are on the first 10 missions of a person's experience in combat. So Tactical Air Command came up with this gigantic exercise and training scenario called Red Flag, and it was all around Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, and hundreds and hundreds of square miles where they would set up surface-to-air missiles, radars. They would have target arrays on the ground, and they could actually create an environment that was very much like what would be going into the Warsaw Pact in Central Europe in war. And there would be days out there where I would lead 70 some odd airplanes, which is big for the modern airplanes, where you're going in. And you would go in and you'd have aggressor airplane come out and fight you, and at the end of this, everybody had a pod, so they knew where everybody's airplane was in space, and they could debrief exactly what happened, who got shot down, and so forth. Well, and this just became declassified several weeks ago. They had a program called Constant Peg, where the United States had gotten MiG-17s, MiG-19s, and MiG-21s, and put them out in the desert there, and we would fly against them. And that would be a subset of red flag. You'd actually do that where you would go over one-on-one with a MiG-17, see what his characteristics were like, one-on-one with a MiG-21, see what his characteristics were like, and then fight a couple of them with you fighting a couple of them. And that program also existed during the F-16 days, and you would fight, and the F-16, they also got a flogger, which was a later generation swing wing, and this was a highly classified thing, because it was very sensitive. You know, I still to this day don't know where they exactly got them. I don't want to know. But it really helped us train against those things. So that's, I didn't have fights with MiGs in actual combat, but so.
How much training did those fellows have that were flying the MiGs? I mean,
Well, they were the best of air combat guys. They would pick them up, and then they would fly them up into the ranges, you know, early in the morning, and they'd fly a couple sorties. And they were very proud men, you know, and they're very good. And but they were very, very, and they had areas out there where they could land if you had a problem. But that just got declassified. That the other thing about the other thing I want to tell you about the Cold War is that it was pretty hot for a lot of people. I've known personally 52 pilots that got killed. That I had contact with, and that were friends of mine or colleagues, or you know, two of them were in Vietnam, and the rest were in practicing to fight the Soviet Union, or in some operation, you know, involved in that. We would practice flying at 100 feet, you know, in F-4s at 500 knots. And we had to do these kind of pop-up maneuvers where you had to come in, because the SAM environment was thought of to be so pervasive that you had to try to get very close to the ground to avoid, you know, get into the ground clutter and avoid being hit by the SAM. So there are a lot of guys that gave their lives in the Cold War. Of course, it never happened, which is good, but I think it never happened because they knew how good we were, and we knew how tough they'd be. You know. I had the opportunity to be a squadron commander at Hahn in Germany, and that was pretty interesting living. I mean, you brought your families over to Europe, and you knew that your country could be attacked by the Soviet Union, and your families were there. We were always practicing with gas masks and very real exercises. We had bunkers we lived in, operated out of bunkers. We would practice sortie rates, and this is where we lost some guys. I mean, we would fly 60 sorties, one squadron would fly 60 sorties a day. I mean, you take off, fly, do some air combat, land, hot pit refuel, the engine's still going, take off, do your thing, come back down, and fly 3 or 4 times a day, because that was what was figured you'd have to do if there was ever a fight with the Soviet Union. They supposedly had a plan to get all the families out of Europe. When they brought all these troops over, they were going to bring the families home, but we never knew. I mean, America was really putting its human treasure on the line over there, you know, in the way of families and so forth. I then, after being a squadron commander over there for an assistant DO, where I was kind of in charge of 3 squadrons. I came back to school, and then I had a stint with the State Department, and the job there was to help draw down the forces in Europe. The wall had fallen, and we went from 395,000 troops to 100,000, and their families left with them. And then I then went back. I was going to be the vice wing commander of the 86th wing at Ramstein. Ended up, the day I got there, my boss left, and I became the commander. And this was a 8,000 person base. And I was also the commandant of the Kaiserslautern military community, which was 60,000 people. And on that base we had 2 squadrons of F-16s. We had a squadron of VIP airplanes. We had a squadron of hospital airplanes. And the former Yugoslavia had started, where the Yugoslavia started breaking up, and our unit started flying over the no-fly zone of former Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina. And what had happened there was that there was all kinds of ethnic cleansing going on, and the Serbs had airplanes where they could bomb villages and so forth. And so the United Nations established a no-fly zone, and if anybody flew up there, they were potentially get shot down. And we put F-16s up over that. And one of my guys shot down 4 airplanes. They were bombing a Muslim village, and we gave them plenty of warning, and they just kept doing it. And well, actually, one F-16 shot down 3, and another guy shot down another one. And then we would get, I don't know if you remember that, like they would have mortar attacks in the marketplace,
Mhm.
and things like that. At Ramstein we had this big hospital called Landstuhl, and on the news now they bring people out of the Middle East and they bring them to Landstuhl and then they ship them back to the United States. Well, that was still in use there, and one of the most unbelievable things in my life was here I was, Russia was the enemy, the Ukraine was the enemy, you know, all the middle countries there were the enemy, and we got a call, our base got a call, and they were going to bring people from one of those mortar attacks into Landstuhl, and what was going to bring them in were some Russian airplanes. So I remember going out to greet it and thinking, boy, the world has changed, you know, and walking up to the airplanes, and they were Russian transports, and the shells opened it up, and they didn't have seats for them or anything. It was just this hollow tube, and these people sitting on the floor without safety belts or anything. And it was really almost a fraud. Some of them were wounded. Some of them had bribed people. One guy got off the plane with his little black book and was trying to call people in Chicago. You know, I think bribery lived. And but we had the whole base set up where we took him up to the hospital. We kind of really, you know, turned out for him and took care of him. So that was interesting, and then to fly in the no-fly zone was interesting, and then let's see, where did I go after that?
No, one thing I think that's probably prior to this, you were in Israel as a an instructor, or
well, when I was that's it. Thanks for asking that question. That's pretty interesting. In the early days of the F-16, you know, the F-16 was an airplane that was a joint project of 4 NATO countries. I mean, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and Netherlands, and they all had a little co-production part of it. And they all built pieces of it, and us. And it was interesting. I remember hearing on the radio one time where somebody was reporting, isn't it interesting how some parts of the F-16 are being, this is during the Cold War, are being shipped on Russian ships. It's an amazing world. But, so we trained all those pilots. I have some good friends that, you know, are Dutch guys and Norwegian guys that I trained in the F-16. And it was really one of the neater experiences of my life. But we also trained the Israelis and the Egyptians in F-16s. And so we had Israelis come to the United States. This was at Hill Air Force Base. And we would give them academics and then some training in the F-16. That was interesting in one thing, in the aspect there. When they fight and talk. When you're fighting your combat, you're doing something with your airplane, but you're also coordinating with the other guys in the fight. You know, and you're telling your intentions. Certain people have certain roles to play, and you may be switching roles, and you're having to coordinate. And you're about ready to shoot ordnance. You want to escape in a certain direction. And you're doing all this coordinating. The Israelis normally speak in Hebrew. Well, we couldn't understand Hebrew. So we asked them to speak in English when they're fighting so that we could hear it, because we were supposed to be supervising the overall thing. Well, that really degraded somewhat, I think, some of their capability, because they're having to figure out translations. Yeah, so that was kind of a fun thing. But anyway, I went over to Israel. They were buying the F-16, and they were also going to buy with it one of the missiles that we were using on the F-16. So I went over and met with some people from the Pentagon and the State Department. I went around to different bases in Israel and kind of told them what the state of the F-16 was at that time, how the testing was looking, and how that missile was looking, you know, where we were with it. And it was a very fine experience for me. And they were very determined, quite wonderful people, and very appreciative of what we were doing. And you really got a feeling at that time too of how they feel like they're surrounded and how narrow and small the country is. You know, by air you could cross that country in a fighter in about 4 minutes. You know, so if you had fighters coming into that country from, you know, they don't have any reaction time. You couldn't scramble off the ground and come up, and you'd have to fight them pretty far out. So they got all kinds of things to work through that, but it was very interesting.
Now, the one thing, can't let you get away with not telling us about flying with your son.
Yeah, I even have some pictures of that. My son ended up going to VMI, and he wanted to be a pilot. And I never tried to encourage him, you know, in any way, but he just, he talked the language very early in his early days. And he went to pilot training, and he went through Shepherd, and he got a fighter. But at the time, the Air Force was short of cockpits. It was during a period of drawdown. And so they were going to make pilots getting out of pilot training go to a desk job for 3 years. And he wanted to fly pretty quick. And so he went around and interviewed with a lot of guard outfits. And the Air Force at the time said, this was the early 90s, if a guard outfit will take you, we'll let you out of your commitment. So he went through pilot training in the Air Force, and he ended up going to Syracuse and flying with the New York State Guard in Syracuse. Well, it just so happens I went to Army War College with a guy who was a commander over at the Syracuse Guard. And it just so happens that we were doing a modification, what they call a block change. The F-16 came out, and they always kept improving it with improved computers and improved fire control systems. And we were bringing a new block of airplanes into Ramstein, and then that block of airplanes was going to Syracuse. So the fellow that was the commander of Syracuse said to Dan, do you think your dad would like to come over here and fly with us and fly with you? Well, that was a decision that took about that long. So, and I have to back up a bit about the airplane he saw with him too, after this. He was in phase 2. They didn't call it phase 2 then, but I flew on one of his checkout rides. I was number 2 in the formation, and he was number 4 in the formation, and we got a chance to fly together. That was a thrilling thing. I still have the sheet, you know, to that. And I have a picture of it. I'll share that with you. The other thing that was kind of interesting is that I said I was early in the airplane, and I kind of had a choice of what the name I wanted on, what airplane tail number I wanted to be mine early in the program. And I was in the 8th Squadron. I started off in the 8th. So I got 008 for my tail number for the first F-16, my first F-16. That airplane went around the Air Force and ended up down in Tucson. And my son got checked out at Tucson after he went through Air Force pilot training and to get his F-16 training. And that airplane happened to be there. And that's the airplane he saw with him. in my airplane. So we've had quite a go for it. And then he went through weapons school like I did, so I went out. One of his outfits flew me out. I flew out in an F-16 to Nellis when he graduated from weapons school. So he is now working in the White House. He's on the White House staff, but he's still in the Guard. And he is flying F-16s with the DC Guard. And he works for the Homeland Security Council and the NSC somewhere on counterterrorism. So we're pretty proud of him.
I don't know if there's anything else that...
Well, I think we're getting close to the end of the tape
Okay.
here. I can tell you one other thing that I think was kind of... I ended up working with NATO in Brussels.
Mm-hmm.
And I went back when the wall fell. A lot of those countries that were in the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and all those, wanted to get into NATO. And I ended up going with a team over there to tell them what the requirements are to get in there. You had to have rule of law, the military had to be under the parliament and so forth. And I went into these countries, and it was amazing to me. Like Poland, for instance, had a constitution. And we were, before we did, we were ready to nuke these countries and elements in these countries. And what had happened was that the Soviet Union and Russia had taken these countries over. These countries didn't want to come under the Soviet Union. And we, therefore, became enemies of a group of people who were taken over by some people we disagreed with and could have, and when we got over there, I mean, a lot of the beautiful cities, I mean, they were just absolutely beautiful, and by this kind of quirky thing, we were enemies with them. And it was really quite something to me to see that and realize, you know, how the world is, and sometimes gets pretty screwed up. But I don't regret a minute of it. It was great serving the country for the years.
Okay, if you held this up like this, tell us where and when that was taken.
Oh, this
Wayne
was.
will focus on that.
Oh, this was taken. This was taken when I was commander of Ramstein in '93.
Okay, got it.
And this one.
Oh, let me. If you want, can you hang on just a second?
Sure.
Let me give you a better picture on that one. I don't know if you can see this one, but this is my son and I. This is that?
If you
Oh,
hold
yeah.
it back, he can come right in
Oh,
on it with the
okay.
camera if you hold it right where you were before.
This is my son and I, and it would be '94. Well, we were flying the day we flew together up at Syracuse.
Okay. Got it.
How do you think your time in service had changed or had an effect on your life?
Oh. Well, first of all, I've been able to work with an awful lot of wonderful people.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen that most of the people are great people. A lot of times, unfortunately, you have to spend a lot of times with folks that are causing problems, but that's a very small minority. And that there are an awful lot of wonderful service people out there that are willing to give of themselves and make ultimate sacrifices for something bigger than them. And now that I've had the opportunity to live in a community that really is a wonderful, self-supporting community that helps each other out tremendously. Some of our best friends, and some of the things I've seen people do for other people have just been tremendous. You know, I hope it's made me a more understanding person. I hope I certainly had a sense of purpose. And it certainly gave me a real strong focus. I mean, I had a focus all the time. And it really made me appreciate my family. My family, when you think of moving 20 times, or more than 20 times, what my wife has done and what my kids did for me is something that probably one of the highest, most regarded things in my life, or what my family's done for me. So and especially my wife, obviously. But, so,
Okay, thank you very much.
sure.